Martin Padfield joined Scientology in 1981 when L. Ron Hubbard was still alive and spent 28 years inside Scientology, including time served in the Sea Organization at the UK headquarters St. Hill and over at the international base in California, and has a wealth of knowledge and tons of stories from his time inside the church. When Martin left in 2009, he dedicated a huge chunk of his time to exposing Scientology and sharing his stories and telling people in the press exactly what it's like to be a Scientologist here in the UK. This is a really fascinating interview, and the first interview I've done with another British Scientologist, so stay tuned. He's got a really interesting tale to tell, and I'll see you at the very end of the video. Hi Martin, welcome to my channel. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me about your story. I know it's been a while since you did anything kind of publicly sharing your story, and you have quite a wealth of history and experience in Scientology. So should we maybe start with you introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about who you are and your journey in Scientology?
I'll keep it brief. I got into Scientology when I was about 19. My name is Martin Padfield, as you can see. And very briefly, my parents' house where I was living at the time, and there was a decorator who was a Scientologist. He was very interesting to me. He had a very interesting way of expressing himself. And I got talking to him, and he just told me about a little bit about Scientology. I routed onto some basic courses in Tottenham Court Road, or TCR as you call it, which is now just the book selling place, I believe, but it was the main org in those days. This is back in a long time ago, 1981 this would have been. And I thought, well, this is good stuff, and did some basic, they call it HAS co-auditing, HAS co-auditing, which was quite good. And the organization was quite busy, and the people seemed enthusiastic, and I just thought, this is pretty cool. So then I was already committed to going to university at that point, so I started university at Loughborough. But my mind was already buzzing with all the, I've read some basic books, and already the recruiters had been on my back about joining staff and so forth. So within a year, I'd signed a Sea Org contract, and I started in the Sea Org down in what used to be called the FOLO, the Flag Operations Liaison Office, down in Rottingdean, near Brighton, in an old disused convent. And that was in spring of 82. And yeah, I started a career in the Sea Org then. That's pretty much it.
So you skipped the middle step of joining staff and then you went straight from public to Sea Org.
I did, because my rationale at the time was that, I mean, bearing in mind I'm a student, I haven't got a career behind me, I haven't got any money behind me. So I thought, well, if I'm going to actually progress in Scientology up the bridge, the only way I'm going to be able to do that is as a full-time staff member. I'm not going to be able to buy services. So, I mean, initially I didn't understand, what the Sea Org contract was. I thought I could just do, a 5-year contract and then see what happened after 5 years. But my recruiter was a girl by the name of Carol Holder. She was at the time. Was very nice, but very persuasive. And I thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Got nothing else planned for the next billion years, so let's give it a go. It sounds ridiculous now, but it made sense at the time.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is when you look back on it and talk about it, I signed a billion-year contract, you kind of think how absurd that sounds. But in the moment, you genuinely believe that that's the right thing to do and the best way to help humankind, right? What was it that how did they sell it to you to get you to that point in your mind? Because for me, I like helping people, and I'm always quite a generous person in terms of like time and effort and energy, and I'm always about pleasing other people. And for me, it was like, well, if you want to help people, this is the best way to help everyone, right? And that's what kind of got me to think, oh, actually, yeah, this is how I can actually help as many people as it's the best way, most effective way. What was
Mm.
it for you that kind of got you to say, yeah, Sea Org is the way forward?
Well, I arrived at that point that you've described, but for me, I was a bit more narcissistic. Really, it was all about me. You know, how can I improve myself? How can I get up the bridge and so forth? But I did come to the conclusion that the only way that made any sense was if everybody was moving up, at the same time. So yeah, I mean the idea of helping was, in fact, I remember the conversation I had with Carol Holder way, all those decades ago, because I did say to her, I said, the London Org was busy and booming and so forth, and I said, this is great, but why isn't everybody doing science on it? If this is so good, why is it so relatively few people doing it? And she said, well, that's down to you. That's up to you. It's not just, you can't just rely on, there's a small handful of us on staff and so forth. So she was pushing that help button, the help button quite hard. So yeah.
Amazing. And if you compare, you were saying that why isn't everyone doing it? And you look at the number of people on course, things have changed a lot over the time that you were in Scientology and now being out of Scientology. Am I right in thinking you were saying there was a time when you were on staff, or when you were public, when it was so popular that you kind of were fighting for a space in the course room?
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. There was two basic courses supervisors, a guy called Andy, and I think the other guy was David Milne, who, funnily enough, ended up in OSA. And there had to be two of them because there was so many people. And yeah, if you didn't arrive on time, you'd be lucky to get a seat. It was extraordinary, really. So you did feel that there was really something going on. That there was a sort of a buzz or excitement around a place, which you would be able to tell better than me, but I don't think is quite the case these days. You don't have to fight for a chair in London Org Academy, I wouldn't have thought, these days.
No, absolutely not. I think I never saw the academy or even the Div 6 course room with more than maybe, I think the max is probably about 20 students or so. And that was the busiest. That was a one-off occasion type thing. I think generally you'd have 10 people in each course room or so on an average day. When is this that we're talking about it being that busy? Is that in the 80s, kind of at the start of your Sea Org career?
That's right. Yeah. I only did basic courses in 1981. Then from 82 till 85, I was in the Sea Org. Then I was, well, you could say kicked out, or I left, take whichever view you want on that. And then I was public again from 85 on and off, really, all the way through to 2009. So yeah, I've seen it from different viewpoints as a staff and a public. But when I was at St. Hill in the tech division in let me think, mid 80s, so yeah, 86, 87, and I was the tech sec, it was very, it was busy. There was we would regularly do, and this is the foundation, not the day. In the foundation side of things, we'd regularly do sort of 200 world on auditing hours a week. And
and foundation, just for those who are listening who aren't quite sure about the splits, a day is so Scientology organizations are run as kind of two separate organizations. You have the day organization, which is kind of Monday to Friday, 9 till 6, and the foundation is the evenings and weekends. And it's kind of like they're run as two separate churches almost, even though they're the same building, right? So when you said you had 200 well done auditing hours, that's just the evening and weekends, right?
That's right. Yeah. The day was doing hundreds, 300-400 hours a week sometimes. And the NOTS at HGC, which the NOTS stands for NED for OTs, which is New Era Dianetics for OTs, basically OT level 5, the 5th level above clear. The NOTS HGC was always full. The OT3 course room was generally pretty full. It was, the whole place was just, was heaving. That sometimes there was a queue outside the registrar's office for people,
Wow.
queuing up to pay for their next service. But you wouldn't
Wow.
get that these days.
Yeah, and how did totally. I've never seen a queue of any kind, not even for like a coffee in the cafe
Yeah.
at London Org. But how did so if you were in from like 1981 to 2009 is when you left as a public, you would have seen that huge shift from being that sort of busy to even in 2009, it's still not going to be nearly as busy as it was back then. How did you sort of justify that in your mind and think, oh yeah, this is, it's not on the decline, we're growing, we're the fastest growing religion in the world, right?
Yeah,
And yet
well, you
you're
know how
seeing
it
less and less
goes.
people there.
Yeah, you know how it goes. You see these events, and there's this org somewhere in America or South America that's booming. So you must be doing something wrong here because they're booming elsewhere. And yeah, it's just the cognitive dissonance thing, isn't it? You try and hold these two opposing you see what you see with your own eyes, and then you get a completely other picture from the events. Mark Headley's done a lot of work on this, actually, or a lot of information on how they put these event videos together and how completely deceptive they are. But no, it was one of the reasons why, ultimately one of the reasons why I left. It wasn't the main reason, but it was obvious that Scientology was on the decline and we were being lied to. And I've got some fascinating correspondence with Graham Wilson, who was the CEO of, or maybe not the CEO, but he was one of the head honchos in OC UK.
And he still is, by the way, just for those watching, Graham Wilson is still at St. Hill, and
Is
he's
he?
still a very high up. I don't know if he's head of OSA or, he is still a very high up executive at St. Hill. And I think he's on a lot of the company registration documents and things like that, along with Peter Hodkin. So he's still in for sure. So this is going to be interesting to hear your correspondence with him.
Well, I've got a thick folder of stuff, still got a lot of it, but we're kind of jumping along the timeline here because now we're in sort of 2009 when I left, and I wrote to him several times and said, Graham, I'm on the cusp of leaving here. I could still be persuaded, show me some stats, But and I asked for a meeting. I asked several times. I said, Graham, let's sit down and talk, and tell me what's really going on, because I'm getting all this information about beatings up at the Int Base, either directly done by or ordered by David Miscavige, and they seem to be very well corroborated. I'm getting all sorts of information about various abuses going on. Things clearly are contracting. But if I'm wrong, let's talk. Let me know. And one of his answers to that, interestingly, was I think it was a Freedom newspaper, which the Office of Special Affairs would put out, which was very interesting. It was supposed to debunk the whole abuses at the Int Base thing. In fact, it did the exact.
Sorry to interject. What sort of time period are we talking about here? Like years?
So we're now in 2009. At the moment, more or less when I left completely. I was really, I was half in and half out for a long time, since the mid 90s. I mean, I went to the ship and had a horrendous experience there. I went to Flag in 2001. I had an even worse experience there. And usually, what you tend to find when the final penny drop moment for most people is when it directly affects them, rather than what they see across the third dynamic, the organization. It's normally when they've had a really bad experience themselves personally that they think, no, this is all wrong. There's a guy very local to me, I won't name him, but he's out, and exactly that thing. He was prepared to justify or rationalize all the contradictions in the state of Scientology as being told to him versus the reality. But when he started getting really mentally damaged and so forth, that was the point. He said, no, enough. So going back to your question, so yeah, now we're in the final out for me was 2009. That's when I had all that to and fro with Office of Special Affairs and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was it that Graham said that was so notable?
Well, nothing. It was the fact that he said nothing that was so notable. I mean, I could probably just I might be able to pull from his emails out now because I mean, basically what he was saying was yeah, okay, I'll meet, but then what's the point really? And he was just sort of fobbing me off. And I mean, I'm not trying to say that I was the most significant person in Scientology, but I had a long and illustrious career on staff, off staff. I was well known amongst the local public in around East Grinstead, and of course, amongst Sea Org members from my time in the Sea Org. I've spent a lot of money on Scientology and the IAS, so I would have expected a little bit more respect, frankly, a little bit more, yeah,
Emotion and human connection, right? Emotion and human connection,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yes, exactly, yeah. So, but yeah, he basically just sort of fobbed me off, and um, I mean, I suppose in fairness, by that time, I'd more or less decided I was out anyway. The 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 off the cliff moment for me was I wrote a resignation letter and posted it on Marty Rathbun's blog. Marty Rathbun at the time was helping a lot of people, come away from the church. I think he's doing the reverse these days, but that's another story. But at the time, he was like a very good sort of soft landing place for people who, they didn't necessarily want to ditch Scientology, the subject, but they certainly wanted out of the organizational machinations and that spider's web of corporate Scientology. So so that was the final end for me in 2009. Yeah. It was an interesting year actually, because I did another little piece for what's going on there, another little interview or a piece for a grad student just helping with a project, and as I said to him in that piece, the coming out process, if you do it with integrity, or if you're honest about things, the coming out process could be really therapeutic. It can be very eventually there's a lot to go through. It is quite tough because in my case, after 28 years this was of being in Scientology, 28 years, you do have to go through some stuff, but it's worth it. And I think in some ways the coming out process was as beneficial and as strengthening, spiritually nourishing as anything that I got within the Scientology, which is ironic to say the least, and very bizarre. And I think a lot of people don't quite, so people anybody watching this, who might still be under the radar, should really understand that the world isn't such an evil, desperate, dangerous place, and there are lots of very, very good people. And in fact, some of the best people around, my friends currently are declared SPs. So there's lots of friends, lots of friendly faces, and people that you can talk to, and there's Facebook groups, and there's all sorts of encouragement and support that you can get. And the idea that you can attain spiritual freedom in a what is essentially well, Aaron calls it a human trafficking cult. His words, not mine. But in any case, in a corporate environment that is so top down, so didactic in that sense, it's just a nonsense. It just, I mean, if you looking at it, rationally, it just doesn't make any sense. How can you possibly have, attain a level of freedom in an organization that's literally going to control every aspect of your life? It's an oxymoron. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And also the goals in Scientology are so binary and so grand. You're never going to achieve the goals, right? Clear the planet, right? And then move on to target 2. Well, there's more people being born a day now
Yeah,
than, when Scientology was invented, and it's just not growing the way you'd expect it to, and you're never going to achieve that goal. And
no,
even if you did achieve the goal of clearing the planet, there are no plans in Scientology of like, what happens when we clear the planet? How do we move to target 2? If
yeah,
L. Ron Hubbard was genuinely serious about achieving this goal and that's what we're going to do, you would
mm,
expect there to be a plan of like, okay, what happens when everyone's clear? Do we
yeah,
close all the orgs because we don't
yeah,
need any orgs anymore? Like that just doesn't exist, right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, somebody pointed out once that the end goal of Scientology is that you don't need Scientology anymore. So there you go.
So all the orgs closed, and yet it's a suppressive crime to close an org. So
Yeah,
what happens when you don't need any orgs?
yeah, 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 yeah. If the end goal is spiritual freedom, well, then by definition, you wouldn't need any structure behind you, you or any
Yeah.
organization. But I mean, Jason, on that, to your point, Jason Begay in his 2 hour interview from I think the same time period, 2009, expressed it really well. And excuse me using a little bit of English because I'll just say it the way he said it.
Go
He
for it.
said that he told the senior case supervisor at CC Int where he was getting his services. He says, "You couldn't clear fucking Beverly Hills at these prices, let alone clear the planet." And that just says it all. It's so true. In fact, I found a price list here from the early 90s and St. Hill. Even back then, one intensive was like $2.5 grand.
Wow.
One
And an
two and a
intensive,
half
for
hours.
those of you who aren't aware, an intensive is like when you buy a package of a number of hours of, or like 12 hours of auditing
Twelve and
in
a half.
one go, right? And you get a discount rather than paying per hour. If you buy a package, you get a bit of a discount. So it's called an intensive. So an
Yeah.
intensive, which is 12 hours of auditing, was £2,500 in the 90s.
Yeah, I've got the exact prices
Wow.
here, but I mean, just insane. And that was
Yeah.
25, 27 years, 28, 30 years ago.
So with inflation, that's probably like 20 grand or something now.
Well, it's a lot more than that, but I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. I remember once reading, I think it was a policy letter, it might have been a bulletin, but it was the solution to inflation. It was called, it was written by Hubbard, and basically what the solution was keep putting the prices up. If you just read this thing, and I read it at the time, I thought that's the solution, is it? Just keep putting the prices up.
Which is inflation by
Yeah,
definition.
absolutely
Yes.
hilarious. But I mean, you think about it. Let's say the average wage in the UK is £30,000 average. Who can afford 20 to 30 grand for a block of intensives? And you're supposed to do this like 3 or 4. I mean, the average cost of getting to OT3, I think, was calculated to be about $500,000, and that's probably excluding IS donations that you'll be expected to make. They're not really optional. You have to make that, and so on. So that's quite conservative.
Mm.
So Scientology is, only ever going to be for rich people, even if you wanted to do it.
And I think also one thing to note is that the majority of Scientologists, because they don't have that quantity of money, don't ever reach that stage of
No,
OT3 where you hear the Xenu story and, galactic overlords and all of this sort of stuff.
yeah,
Most Scientologists don't even know, they're not aware that that's the
no,
scripture, because then they haven't achieved that goal. So all of this kind of coercive control and stuff we're talking about of the, what Scientology actually is and how it affects people, that all happens before you even get to hear the wacky stories in the advanced levels, right?
yeah, absolutely. You get little snippets of information on the training levels. If you're training up to be a class 4 or class 5 auditor, in some of the lectures, he'll I think quite deliberately chuck in some of the space opera stuff to kind of whet your appetite for what's to come later. And again, going back to your earlier question about what inspired interested you to join the Sea Org so soon was partly not the space opera per se, but I have to say that the appeal, the lure of the idea of OT and operating, outside of the body, etc., etc. Yeah, I have to say that was attractive. That was and that was the thing, and it was talked about a lot. There was maybe there still is a monthly or bi-monthly magazine. I can't remember the name of it now, but it always had these OT phenomena
You're
stories
talking
in
about
the.
Impact magazine.
No, it wasn't Impact. No, that's an IS publication. No, this
Mm.
was um, it was put out about the advanced
Source?
level.
Source
Pardon?
magazine? That was another one. Source?
No,
No.
no, that was more to do with organizational.
Yeah. Doesn't matter. Another
Oh,
magazine.
advanced. It was called Advanced.
Oh,
Advanced.
Advanced. Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And there'd always be this little section that everybody would flick to straight away in the when the magazine, a new one came out, which was the OT Phenomena success stories. And there would be things like, I was in a traffic jam, and I just using my OT intention, I made the traffic disappear. All this sort of stuff. Stories that you could, you could find, you could pick up from any religion or activity, like that. Similarly, when you broke them down and analyzed what was actually being said, it was like, okay, you're in traffic and the traffic started moving. Is basically what happened. You know what I mean?
But you don't do that when you're in Scientology and you signed your SEAL contract, you gung ho about it, for lack of it's a Scientology term, but you're really wanting this to work and you think this is the best way to help people. So when you read these success stories, you're not reading them with a critical mind and thinking, oh, this guy
Correct.
obviously just, the light just happened to turn green when he was thinking
Correct.
this.
Yeah.
You're reading it and thinking this is true, this is factual, these people are
Mm.
having these wins,
Yeah.
and you want to get there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very clever. It's very clever sort of marketing in that sense. It's the old bait and switch, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Basically.
Well, before we delve into too many rabbit holes, I think I want to draw it back a little bit and just kind of,
Sure.
I feel like we've skipped a lot of your journey in Scientology, right? So we got to the point where you signed your SEAL contract and we had an overview. What did you do in the Sea Org? What was your, from 81 to when you left in 2009, what was your
Sure.
journey like?
Well, the SEAL career was only 5 years, and I suppose you could say I moved up the ranks fairly swiftly. I tried to put all my reservations and considerations to one side and just, get stuck in. The whole of the whole of the management moved from this little ex-convent in Rottingdean up to St Hill in '84. So from then onwards, I was working either at St Hill. Well, okay, so the really, I suppose, interesting part of my SEAL story was when I was kind of headhunted by Kenny Siebold, who was the head of security at the Int Base, or actually his full job title was Deputy Staff Exec Int for Security. Don't they love these garbled?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was his title anyway.
Sure.
But that was the.
And this is the Int Base over in California, right? Where Goal of Scientology is, and
that's right, but the reason he was over in the UK was because that was the exact moment when the IS Formation Summit was taking place. That was the beginning of the IS. So all the top brass of Scientology were there. Heber was there, the president, obviously, David Miscavige and Vicky Asnaran, who was, I think, the Inspector General at the time. Anyway, all the big wigs were there. But he had an additional brief to find somebody in the UK to take back to the States, get trained in security, then fire back to the UK to put a security force at St Hill. And I didn't want to go initially, but I did go. And the basic training was in LA, which was kind of fun, nice, interesting, or whatever. We patrol Hollywood in these cars that looked like police cars with our PR24 buttons and things. It was all a bit surreal for a 21-year-old, wide-eyed, kid from suburbia in South London. But anyway, I did my security sec checks. We were bussed off up to the Int Base at night. It's always at night, by the way. So you don't know, it's quite disorientating. But I was at the Int Base for a year, but I was only in security training at the Int Base for I think it was about 6 to 8 weeks before I was busted off of that and put onto the RPF. And the RPF being the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is by any other name a punishment camp. Let's call it what it is. It's a pretty brutal regime, and especially up at the Int Base, even more so. They've more or less done away with it these days, but it was a big thing back then. And I basically dozed off on what I hadn't fulfilled my security training duties adequately. So I was busted off of that, put on the RPF, and if you think North Korean re-education camp with hard labor thrown in, you're kind of more or less there. That's more or less what it was like. I mean, the hours were ridiculous. Sometimes would work up to 48 hours at a stretch without sleeping. The targets were completely bonkers. We were building the LRH music studio at that time. In fact, we had a special status. We weren't just the RPF, we were the GCT. That was the gold construction team. And there were all sorts of characters on that RPF, I can tell you. But this is at the time when Miscavige was in the process of taking over the church. So a lot of the old guard management were on there, so like Wendell Reynolds and Steve Marlowe and people like that, who had been big at the time, were on that RPF. And the bosun was Miles Mellor, who I knew from the UK. He'd been the CEO of what was the Guardian's office that became the Office of Special Affairs. He was on that RPF as well. But
wow. And CEO is commanding officer. That's like the top brass person in charge of that division, right?
Yeah, that's
so
right.
he was with you in the RPF, helping to build the LRH music studio.
Yes. Yeah. And we were birthed at this place called Happy Valley, which is an interesting, most misnamed place in the history of anything. But to get from the Int Base to Happy Valley, it was about a 20-minute bus drive, and you'd have to drive through this Saboba Indian reservation. And they didn't like Scientology. They didn't like Scientology, and it was always a little bit awkward driving through there. But Happy Valley itself was really out in the desert. I mean, it is. I say desert. It's high desert. It's not like you think of Arabian North African desert, but it's still the high desert. So we'd be birthed there at like 16, I think it was, to a room. I mean, just crazy conditions. I don't think there was any hot showers there. But very often we didn't even see the birthing for like days on end, because we'd literally be on site building this freaking music studio. Because at the time Hubbard was still alive. This is 1984, 85 now. Hubbard died in 86, and the expectation was that he was going to come and use the studio, which was, even at the time I thought that's never going to happen, and sure enough, it never did. But because of that, it all had to be built to his so-called standards or his specification. I mean, Hubbard had a particular phobia about smell, so everything had to be odorless. We had to spray everything with this thing called Zelac, all the plasterboard, everything. There was a lot of extra work involved in making this thing, which you wouldn't, as tricky as building a music studio is, there was a lot of extra layers of stuff that you had to contend with to make it conform. But yeah, so it was a pretty brutal program. That there were people that lost fingers on chainsaws. There was a guy that fell off scaffolding and nearly broke his back. The health and safety was just non-existent. It was crazy. You had to run, and this is a building site. You had to run from job to job on a building site, with planks, nails sticking out of them, and I mean it's completely insane. At the end of it, I was in the carpentry section, and one of the execs made us, because there was a lot of highly skilled people on that, and even those that weren't became quite good. So I became pretty handy at carpentry. So at the end of the when the studio was finished, somebody said, well, you need to write up your hats and and pass on, you know, your knowledge and so forth. I think I was expected to write up a thing on carpentry or whatever. I didn't. I wrote a health and safety piece. I said, this is what you should be doing. That didn't go down very well.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was 85, and then I was still on the RPF, but I had to go back to the UK. My visa had expired. Bizarrely enough, I petitioned to stay at the Int Base at that time because that's what it does to your head. I thought,
even though you were in such horrible living and working, you know,
yeah,
circumstances, you still wanted to stay because you felt like you were helping, you were doing the right thing, right? And
yeah,
you were part of this big project to build this music studio, and you know, you
yeah,
feel like you have a purpose there, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So went back to the UK, got a reprieve from the RPF, and then I actually did put the security force, even though I'd hardly done any security training there. It was still like, well, that's what you came for. Put a security force at St. Hill, so I did, and it's still there now. Well, not the one that I put there, obviously, but the genesis of it is what we put there. So yeah, and then and then I went into tech. I was busted off to security because I had a minor out 2D incident, they call it. So I went out with a girlfriend, basically, which is my boat in the Sea Org. Can't do that. So then I was put into tech, which is where I wanted to be in the first place, really. But, and that was the last 2 years of my Sea Org career. But they were quite interesting years in the sense that, for two reasons. One is that, again, going back to your first thing about the org, it was, you know, you were interfacing with the public on a daily basis, and so that was nice. And it was quite busy. You know, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it particularly, but it was nothing like the intensity and the insanity of the Int Base, except for the abusive nature of not just Scientology, but particularly the Sea Org mentality. It feeds through all the way down to the lower levels. The commanding officer at that time was a guy called Tony Phipps, and he was a complete psycho. He was a Jekyll and Hyde personality. It was all lovely and sweet one minute, and then he would just absolutely lose it the next minute. There was one meeting of division heads, I can't remember what it was called now, but a production meeting basically, where a solid glass ashtray missed my head by a few centimeters that he'd been throwing at me for saying the wrong thing. So, you know,
it wasn't St. Hill here in the UK, right?
St. Hill,
yeah.
Yeah. It got so bad actually that I went down to, because the management by this time was just down the driveway, just between St. Hill Manor and the castle. There was those buildings off to the right. I can't remember what that was called now, but that's where the management was. And I thought, I don't know if these guys know how out of control this guy is. This is just mad. He and the guy called, I think his name was Cameron Fraser, who was the flag rep, would literally walk round the org with these sticks, like beating them against their hands, like, who are we going to beat next? You know, it's just, they didn't usually beat people with sticks, but it was just that threat was always there, that you know, you're next sort of thing, kind of.
I think that's something that I noticed as well. Obviously I came into Scientology when after there was already a lot of press and news out there about abuses and things that happen in Scientology, and you know, my journey in was perhaps slightly different to yours in that sense. But even though you're aware of these things that happen, it's framed in your mind as a kind of, well, maybe that's just how it's done in America and that's not how it is here in the UK. It's you know, America have this like crazy wacky version of Scientology, and you know, in the UK it's a lot more tame and a lot calmer, and actually they must be doing something wrong in America because that's not what Scientology is. It's different here. And then coming out, you realize that no, this isn't something that just happens on the off chance around David Miscavige or on certain bases. This is something that's built in and ingrained into the very core of what Scientology is. Like you say, the Sea Org mentality, it breeds and cultivates and encourages sort of ridiculous behavior like that, and
Mm.
that's going to happen anywhere in the world, wherever you are, if you're involved in the Sea Org.
Yeah. Well, anybody that had their eyes open would have seen this. There was a time, for example, when because there's a nice pretty lake down at the bottom of the grounds at St. Hill. Mike Rinder was thrown into that lake at St. Hill, when for saying that or doing the wrong thing. So it was omnipresent. And you just reminded me about something else, actually, because we're talking about because your senior was Charlie Wakley, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. So I was in Div 6A. Charlie, the first time I was on staff, he was my senior as the PCS, Public Contact Secretary. And then I left and then came back, and he'd been promoted to the PES or PES, which is the Public Executive Secretary. And now I believe he's the DED, Deputy Executive Director of London Org.
Okay.
But Charlie and I worked very, very closely together in London Org, and we were very good friends, and he was really instrumental in keeping me involved and gung-ho about Scientology, and we got on really well. We were really good friends at the time. Yeah. But you have an interesting connection to the family, right?
I do indeed. I knew all the boys, Charlie, Jason, and Matt, isn't it?
Yes,
Matt?
yeah. Matt was
Yeah,
a course
yeah.
sup. Jason was an ethics officer.
Yeah. Obviously, they were kids. They were much younger, but I knew them all, and but I knew their dad particularly well, Nick, and I got on really well with him. I considered him a really good friend, actually, and around about, I don't know exactly when. I think it was the early 90s. So I was sort of half in it. I wasn't really on lines that much, so I didn't know about this till Nick told me much later. But when he was, I think he was the CEO of St. Hill Foundation, the commanding officer. There was a time when, and Nick told me this himself. Nick's one of the very few people, I think, UK staff or public, that have personally been beaten up by David Miscavige. Because there was a time when DM was over, Miscavige was doing an inspection or something. And the story, as Nick told me, is that there'd been some out TD, some and but
kind of relationshipy type things, right? With
yeah. I don't know to what extent or whatever. It's irrelevant. But the point is, you do these overts and withholds write-ups, these OW write-ups. So he'd written it up, and he thought that situation was all handled and so forth. And so the way Nick tells the story is that David Miscavige said to him, "So, what have you been up to?" In that really aggressive tone that he has. And so Nick said, "Well, I don't know what you mean, so," because he thought that David Miscavige knew that it was all written up and so forth. So Nick said, so he grabbed him and said, "Come on, what are you up to?" Really, and started really pushing him around and beating him around. And Nick was like, "Sir, I honestly don't know what you're talking about." But even when I heard that story, I thought, Nick, I bet you that Miscavige did know exactly that it had all been written up, but was putting on him because he just wanted to put on him. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. To assert his authority and control and take
Yeah.
out some anger on someone, right?
So Nick was genuinely kind of like, but what are what's going on here? Because, I've written it all up and I'm taking responsibility. But that to me was an interesting story, because it just showed you how pervasive that, going back to what we were saying a minute ago, that abusive atmosphere is. I mean, Nick was, he was quite a character. He had a very colourful there was always something going on with Nick, which I think he was declared at least twice, possibly even 3 times. He was declared SP.
Really?
I think, definitely at least twice that I know of,
Wow.
And there was always just something going on, and I don't know if I can tell you how one particular incident about Nick and what happened when he was a teacher, Can I relay
It's
that?
up to you. I would say let's probably not, just in case,
Okay.
because we wouldn't
Well,
want to
let me
get,
just put it this way. He did
yeah.
something not very good. He did end up at Her Majesty's pleasure as a result of that. And let's just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah, which for the American folk there, that means, you know, he served some time for
Yeah.
doing something that we won't get too into. But I remember you mentioning when we spoke previously that Osa had a bit of a hand in that, because he was such a you know, committed Scientologist. When he was sent to prison about, you know, something he'd done, Osa want to kind of control the flap, right? So they had a hand in trying to cover it up so that it didn't become public knowledge that a Scientologist
Yeah.
has gone to prison.
Yeah. This was a major PR flap, major PR flap. So they did a pretty good job of, I mean, most of the local Scientologists didn't even know. Well, his sons must have known, and I don't know
Mm.
how they handled it, how they processed that, but they could not possibly have not known.
Yeah.
So I'd be very curious to know how Charlie and Jason and Matt dealt with that. But I got to take my hat off to Natalie for standing by him despite all that, and what a stoic woman she
Mm.
must be.
And this is what I was going to say a second ago. Is I find it really interesting that when you told me these stories for the first time just the other day, I was shocked. Right, I spent pretty much all day every day with Charlie. I knew him very well. He was a good friend of mine. He was my senior. We went out book selling. He was a really cool guy, and yet I knew nothing about any of these stories to do with his father being declared multiple times, being, you know, abused by David Miscavige. And the Wakley family are among the most dedicated
Mm,
Scientology families in the UK. You know, Natalie, the mum, Nick's wife, she last time I checked was in the test centre I see. So she was in charge of the Tottenham Court Road branch. She used to come book selling with us every week. Jason is now in the Sea Org over in LA, and Matt, I don't know if he's still on staff, but he was of course Soup, and obviously Charlie's the deputy executive director. So these are really committed. It's a really committed family that are fully in Scientology, and
mm.
yet there's so many stories of abuse and crazy activity so close to home within their family, and yet they are still committed. And I think that's what Scientology does, is even though you're a personal victim, or only one step away from it, you still think that it's for the greatest good, for the greatest number of dynamics, right?
Yes, it's pretty strange. Well, I don't know if it was Nick's rationale, but the rationale for the because even the Scientology public would tend to a little bit keep their distance from Nick because he was such a sort of a not random character. I mean, this is a super intelligent guy. He got a first in engineering at Cambridge University. He was no idiot. And I believe, very sadly, he died about 5 or 6 years ago of cancer. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But so the rationale was that he was stuck on OT3 for years, and that's why he behaved so erratically, should we say? Yeah. So there's
That's
always
crazy.
something. It's never, this is the other thing that you learn as you're coming out, that everything that you've been told to believe is your fault, or your responsibility. It's never Scientology. There's always some, you know so you've got misunderstood, your ethics are out, this da da da. So and yet on the other hand, Scientology handles everything. So
Mhm.
what
Someone
would
threw
you
an ashtray at your head,
yeah.
right? Well, what did you do to cause that? Why
Yeah,
did you allow
exactly.
that to happen? Well, I didn't do anything. Someone just threw an ashtray at me. Yeah, well, that's your fault, right? Because in
Yeah.
Scientology, the belief is that you are a spiritual, immortal being with more ability and power and control than you could ever imagine. And it
Yeah.
starts off it being framed in a positive way of going, okay, well, that means I'm in full control of my environment, and I have the
Mm.
ability to control the sort of environment I'm in, which is a very positive thing. But then when you get to situations of being a victim of some sort of abuse or violence or whatever, well,
Mm.
that policy still applies. You know, why did you put yourself in a situation where you could be beaten up or you could have an ashtray thrown at you? Which is,
Yeah,
that's where the
yeah,
damage really starts to set in.
yeah, that's right. And that's uh, presumably why um, the victims of the Danny Masterton, um, sort of, people are always reluctant to come forward in Scientology when there's been sexual or physical abuse, because they know essentially that they're going to be told, well, what did you do? How did you must have pulled it in? So a girl was raped, but somehow that's her fault. It's like, yeah, it's bizarre, when you look at it from that point of view. Yeah,
Mm.
it's really bizarre.
And then just looking at kind of on that note of, you would carry emotions and anger and these sorts of things through when you hear these stories, and upset, obviously. Um, when you left the church, you didn't leave quietly, did you? You have a bit of history of, doing some things that the church maybe aren't happy about.
Yeah.
And was that, we'll get into exactly what it is in a second, but what was it that fueled that kind of desire to not just leave quietly and live your own life, but actually take a stand and do something about it? Was it because you had these personal stories and things like that, or what?
No, not at all. It was exactly where you started this interview. It was a desire to help, because I thought, because I was having so many wins coming out of Scientology. I thought, and there's that classic question at the examiner after every session: would you want others to have the same gains as you're having? I thought, yeah, I would actually. So I just wanted some. Yeah, seriously, that's what it was. I just wanted some of my friends and people that I knew, whether they wanted to change Scientology or not, I just wanted them to have all the information so they could do a proper doubt formula, or however they wanted to process, to work it through. But to deny them half the story, so they're literally only getting half the information in order to be able to make decisions and come to conclusions, just didn't seem right to me. So my motivation was purely and simply to wasn't really to sell anybody on the idea of coming out of Scientology. It was just to say, look, this is going on as well. And I went to Nick Wakley, was one of the first people I went to when I started, realizing a bit more about, because even though I'd worked at the Int Base and I'd seen some pretty abusive stuff, even then I didn't know how bad it had got. And this was around about the time when the Debbie Cook story was coming up, for example. Do you know the Debbie Cook story?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So she basically wrote an email to thousands of Scientologists around the world saying, not an anti-Scientology email, just saying this policy isn't being applied and this is wrong and so forth. And, perhaps we should do. It was a very constructive email. But the abuse that she suffered was horrific. And it's, to the best of my knowledge, was the only time when it went to court, and actual abuses that actually taken place in Scientology were exposed in a legal framework. And of course, the church had no answer for this because it was true. So they just walked away from that case. And she's bound by legal agreements, but no doubt she got a very, very hefty settlement, as a result, because they couldn't fight that case. It was a very interesting bit of Scientology history. But she was not waterboarded, but she was dunked in a barrel of water with a sign of Lesbo run. I mean, just horrible, horrific stuff. So all this came out in court. Where was I? I got sidetracked.
We were talking about you leaving and speaking out, and what
Yes.
fueled that.
Oh, yes. So that was my motivation, really. It was just to try and get other people to have the same wins as I was having.
And what is it you did when you left? Just in a kind of nutshell, because I know we are starting to come towards the end of our time, but what is it that you that you did as an official SP now that you've left, you know, because you've done lots of interviews with BBC and things like this, and really shining the spotlight on Scientology in the UK. What, you know, what were the sort of things that you did, and how did Scientology respond? You know, can you tell us a bit about the fair game side of things you experienced as well?
Yeah, I wasn't subject to too much fair game, in fairness. I mean, I had a hate web page put up on me, as they do. You know, they've got the who is so and so domain names for people like Mark Headley, Mike Wilson. So there was one on me but it came and went fairly quickly. So fair game wise, it wasn't that much. But what I did quite a lot, actually, one way or another. There was one memorable night when it was the IS event. I think this would have been 2009, when I'd been able to get the logo off the internet for that event, and basically put the IS branding on hundreds of envelopes and put a little letter inside each one, put them all on the cars in the car park. For example. Yes, Graham, that was me. I'm sure you knew that anyway.
If he didn't, mystery solved from all of those years ago. Finally, we know who did it.
I also, that same event, actually, Tom Cruise was staying at a hotel in Forest Row, and I knew where he was, so I wrote a letter to him, and I had it hand routed, couriered, basically. So I know he did receive it, just explaining a few things to him. So, yeah.
Wow.
What else did I do?
And you have some experience with legal cases as well, right? You were
that's right. Yeah, that's what I did want to mention, actually, because there was one particularly interesting situation. My pension had been not managed, but the broker for it was a company called Sovereign Finance, which was owned by Tom Schuster, who may have retired by now, must be in his late 70s probably. But a ex-GO staff, Guardians Office staff. And so after I left, I think in 2010, I called up Sovereign Finance as a client of theirs and said, I need to talk about my pension and how to do it. And Tom said, well, I can't talk to you because you left the church, and that's that. I said, Tom, I'm a client of yours. We need to, but he wasn't having it. So after a bit of to and fro, I took him to the financial ombudsman, and to cut a long story short, there was a lot of correspondence to and fro, but I basically won the case, and I've got it right here. It says in summary, my final decision: I uphold this complaint. Sovereign Finance should pay me £250 in recognition of the trouble and upset it caused. It should also write to Mr. A with an apology. So basically, what all that means is that my case was discrimination. They were basically discriminating against me for not being a Scientologist, and so I won that case, and they had to write a letter of apology and pay me compensation, which was quite nice. Wow. But that's I
was just going to say that's a landmark thing in the world of Scientology in the UK, because there are a very few number of legal cases that Scientology have faced here in the UK. There's lots of stuff going on in America and Australia, but Bonnie Woods is one example. She won a harassment case, and where Scientology had to apologize for harassing her with the fair game stuff. And there's a very limited number of these legal actions against Scientology here. So the fact that you were able to take it to the financial ombudsman and got an apology and some money is I think it's a landmark thing that I don't want people to look over. This is a huge deal.
Right, I was very proud of it. I was very happy about that. And also, there is something now which I'm going to bring back to life again. I started an action with the Information Commissioner's Office, which is essentially, to keep it simple, Freedom of Information Act and so forth means that you're entitled to know what organisations, what information they hold on you. So I started an action with the ICO years ago to try and get them to release everything they had on me, ethics folders, personnel folders, even PC folders actually. but any CCTV they hold, and they have to do this, legally. Peter Hodkin, who was the probably still is the cult solicitor, was quite clever in managing that. So they did have to release some information, but it was very, very limited. I know that it was a fraction of what they should have released, but now it's a lot more stringent. The rules are really tight and clear now. So there's a good chance that they might have to. And the reason I'm talking about this is because, anybody has the right to put even just a basic freedom of information request in. Now they will use their priest penitent, privileged line and angle to try and suppress that. But actually, first of all, Scientology isn't recognized, as you covered in one of your videos recently, isn't recognized as a religion. And second of all, that might apply to PC folders, arguably, but it certainly wouldn't apply to CCTV footage, ethics data, reports written on you, any basic information about you. That wouldn't apply. So, I've got a lot of correspondence with the ICO office on that, so that's ongoing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gosh. I think. Yeah, just as we start to round up, very kind of briefly, I think maybe let's talk very briefly about your recovery process, because obviously you've been out a long time and you're very active in the press and in the media when you first came out. Where are you at now with your recovery and activity against Scientology publicly?
Sure. Well, I don't do much activity. Nothing that I'm prepared to say now, anyway, sure. Publicly. But recovery process is interesting. It's a lot longer and more involved than you think. And so I don't really know where I'm at. You'd have to ask somebody looking at me who's known me all that time to more objective. I mean, I think I'm getting there, but Scientology is, I think, of all cults around the world, is probably the one that has the most pervasive grip on you over a long period of time. So the recovery process for me is just an ongoing process. And I said to one of my friends, actually, a never Scientologist friend, a few years ago, he said, "Are you an ex-Scientologist?" And I thought about this. I thought, no, I'm actually still a recovering Scientologist. And I think that is probably a better way of saying it. Possibly that process goes on for the rest of your life. I don't really know, maybe. But having said that, I don't have the urge to use Scientology lingo or terms these days. And if I do, I can spot it straight away. I don't really think about Scientology that much. It's just, that was then. Life's busy and interesting. I haven't got time for a start. Running a family and a business, and I've got all sorts of other interests and stuff going on in my life. Life is.
And then you have people like me bugging you and asking you to tell your story.
Bloody Alex on the phone.
All right. Well, finally, the last question I like to try and end my interviews with, if I can. It's a new thing I'm starting with my new channel. It's a bit of a curveball. I haven't prepared you for this. If L. Ron Hubbard was back for a day and sat there right in front of you right now, what would you say to him?
I'd say, Ron, things didn't quite go according to plan, did they? But he knew that anyway. This is the interesting thing. There's a fascinating story by Steve Fouth, his name is, who was with L. Ron Hubbard the very last few days of his life. And Hubbard knew that, he'd screwed up big time. So I wouldn't be telling Hubbard anything that he didn't already know. But what I would try and have a conversation with him about is how he could do his liability formula, how he could make up the damage done.
Amazing. Martin Padfield, thank you so much.
Yeah, very welcome. Been fun. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in, guys. I hope you found that conversation insightful and interesting. I certainly learnt a lot from Martin and my conversations I've had with him, and I hope you have too and have managed to take away something from our conversation. If you want to support the channel, the best way of doing that is clicking the like button, subscribe, comment, all that sort of stuff. I know it sounds cheesy, but you got to do it. And if you want to contribute financially, you can always buy me a coffee with the link in the description. But otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you guys on the next one.